Today's daf we're going to be learning is Bava Batra daf Kuf Bet. This is the daf for Shabbat. I'm going to start before we go back to the Mishna that we started, which actually is a Mishna both in Ohalot and in Masechet Nazir. We're going to talk a little bit about burial spots. So when people would bury, they would generally bury in burial caves. Now, what happens if this issue that the Mishna is dealing with is if you come across a body and then there's another body and another body, or we'll see how many bodies exactly. You're digging somewhere. Do you assume that there was maybe a burial cave there? Now, what does it matter? Well, the way it works is like this. First of all, the first thing you do when you find a dead body is try to figure out if it's a Jew or a Gentile. How do you know? Well, Jews had unique, like there was a particular way they would bury people, mostly lying down, face up. If the body is not in the normal manner, then you assume either it was a Gentile, which means you can move it because there's no problem to move the bones of a Gentile, or it's a Jew, but then the question depends on how the Jew was left there. If the Jew, so first of all, if it's not in a normal manner, then we assume the Jew was just kind of put there because there was a rush and they just threw the body down onto the ground and moved on. And that's a temporary burial spot. Now, anytime we have a temporary burial spot, there's two ways we can move a grave. Either it was a Gentile or it was a temporary grave and never meant to be permanent. Then you can actually move it. If it was in a permanent burial spot, then you can't. So if we find it in a burial cave, it's obviously a permanent burial spot. But what if it was in a burial cave and it was the cave collapsed and you don't know if it was a burial cave or not? So how do you determine if you think this body was buried in a burial cave or not, or it was just kind of thrown there? So there's all different kind of ways that we can figure this out. Another issue that comes up, the commentaries point out, is if the body was, if the person looked like they were dead or they were killed, like if they were brutally murdered, you can tell that you can actually move the body because the assumption is it wasn't buried a proper burial. Okay, that it's a little tricky how we figured all that out, but that's something the commentaries talk about. Anyway, it's not dealt with directly here, so we're going to leave that issue aside right now. So the issue becomes, if I find a dead body, can I move it or not? Okay, assuming it's a Jewish body, how do I know if I can move it? So the Mishna had said, we read this yesterday, if you find the body lying in its normal manner, that's what it means, kidarko, like the Jewish body would be buried. But you're still allowed to remove it because it's only one body, and we assume it wasn't in a particular burial plot, and probably people put it there and meant to move it. So you take it out with the tfusa, with the earth, with the soil underneath. How much? Some people say 3 tvachim, some people say 3 fingers, okay, 3 hands breadth or 3 fingers, okay, which is less than 1 hand's breadth. What's the issue with tfusa? So some people say it's a source in the Torah. Yaakov said, the Gemara says in Satani mi Mitzrayim, that Yaakov said, please take my body from Mitzrayim, or where else they're going to take it from. So the fact that he adds the word mi Mitzrayim means he meant with some of the earth of Mitzrayim along with me. That's one reason. Some people say, no, that's just an asmachta. That wasn't meant to say it's a Torah law. But the real reason is respect for the dead. You want to take anything that might have parts of the dead body in it, and then it's a bit of a different issue. And then it's also takanat chachamim, only not from the Torah. So if it's 1 or shnayim, notlam bet fusatan, also 2, we assume it's not from a burial plot because they didn't usually bury just 2 people. But matzah shlosha, as soon as you find 3, you can assume, now what did we say before, right? The walls of this, the way the kuchim worked in burial caves, so 3 could be 3 bodies buried on one side or the other side of the burial cave. And remember, there was either 4 by 6 amot, 4 by 6 cubits, or 6 by 8 cubits. So the assumption is if you find 3, it all depends on in what kind of space they were found. If it's between 4 to 8 cubits that it was found, then you can assume that it was a side of the burial cave, either the 4 cubit side or the 8 cubit side. Now, you might be thinking, wait, we didn't have a 4 by 8. It was either 4 by 6 according to the rabbis, 6 by 8 according to Rabbi Shimon. So that's a good question. We'll have to figure that out. But right now, it says 3 within that space. Not only that, how could it be on the side of 4? Because if there's 3, if they're lying parallel, like the Rashbam says they're lying parallel, you'd have to explain that there was less than an amma in between, perhaps like Rabbi Shimon and Gamliel, so depending on the soil, you could put them closer together, and then you could fit 3 on a side of 4. Because of that, Rabbeinu Tam suggests that maybe there are 2 with 1 lying the other direction, but I want to go into that right now. So if it's from 4 to 8, harezo shchuna kvarot, then already we call that It must have been a burial plot. Now, if it's a burial plot, well, what did we learn? They usually put two burial plots, right, near each other, surrounded one courtyard, one on one side, one on the other. So because of that, you have to be concerned that maybe there's more bodies there. So you count 20 cubits on the body in order to make sure there's no other bodies there. Okay, we're going to have to get back to this number 20. Where did they get it from? Okay, because let's just do the calculation already. If you say like the rabbis, the long side is 6, then you have the courtyard is 6, and then another one is 6. That would be 18, not 20. If you say like Rabbi Shimon, it would be 8, 6, and 8. 8 for each cave for the long side, and 6 for the courtyard. That would come out to 22. Nothing really matches this 20 number. We'll have to get back there. Now, while you're checking, if you happen to find one body, one lone body, somewhere within the 20 cubits, even though it's one lone body, since there was already a burial cave here, you have to go even farther and check another 20 cubits from that body that you found, because it's already, right? Sometimes, so according to Rabbi Shimon, right, there could have been multiple around this one courtyard. According to the rabbis, maybe, right, where you're in an area where there's a lot of burial caves. So Raglayim l'davar means there's already proof on the ground that there's a burial plot here, and therefore, once you find just one, you have to check more. But if you just found it on its own, without any other bodies here, then you wouldn't have done that. But because then this just goes back to strength, because you already found 3, there's already like we call it usually a chazaka that there's dead bodies here and it's a burial cave plot. Therefore, we're going, a burial cave. So therefore, we're going to be extra careful. Now we have to go back and try to reconcile this with our Mishnah. Amar Mar said in the source, "Me arba vad shmone mani irabanan ha'amre arba mod al shesh." The rabbis already told you this. It's 4 or 6, right? It's 4 by 6, which means either it's on the 4 side or it's on the 6 side. They would be spread out in that kind of area. By the way, what we mean is if they're more spread out, then it's too much, right? If they're less spread out, then it's too many. And why is it a problem? Because if they're more spread out, we assume it's not a burial plot because they would have been near each other. If it's all piled up on top of each other, then they must have just been thrown in, right? Unfortunately, what image you conjures up in my head, like these plots in the Holocaust where they just threw bodies on each other and there was no proper burial, then again, that's a case where you're allowed to move the bodies. So it wouldn't be 4 to 8 though, it would be 4 to 6. And if it's Rabbi Shimon ha'amar shesh al shmone, said 6 by 8. So it would be 6 to 8, not 4 to 8. So how did we get to 4 by 8? To which the Gemara answers, Lo Olam Rabbi Shimon. It really must be Rabbi Shimon. And how can we explain it? Hi Tanahu de Tanya goes like the Tana of this Braita, which we're going to assume we're now going to have a Braita with Tanna Kamma, an unnamed opinion, and a second opinion of Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda, who says something in the name of Rabbi Shimon. And what they're going to assume, okay, this seems to be at least the way the Rashbam understands this, so that they're referring actually to Tanna Kamma, and that they're assuming there's Tanna Kamma is Rabbi Shimon, according to one Tanya's opinion, and a different Tana understands Rabbi Shimon differently. Either which way we're going to see the Rabbi Shimon, the Tanna Kamma here seems to say a plot is 4 by 8. So let's read it inside. Theoretically, you could also understand the second opinion like it, but there's a separate problem with doing that. I'm not going to get into too many off-the-topic details here. So now they say the following. What's the Braita? Tanya mitza'an retzufin. This is what I said. If they're piled up, okay, ve'ein benehem arba'ad shmone. And you don't have, now you're missing a little word here, but you don't have, within the piled up, it could be it's somewhere between, we don't know how much it is, but you don't have 3 within a space of 4 or 8. In other words, you have a lot more. So because you have a lot more, even though maybe it is 4 by 8, but the bodies take up, right? You don't have 3 in a space of 4 by 8 or 4 in a space of 4 by 8, which could work, 4 or 8, which could work. Really, it's 4. It's saying there's more than 3, let's say, in a space of 4. Well, then we don't have, right? This must be the bodies were piled up. And then it doesn't look like a burial plot, then yesh lem tfusa ve'en lehem shchunat kparot. Then you just take the bodies with the dirt underneath, and you don't call this a burial area, right? A burial plot. But Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda omer, mishum Rabbi Shimon ro'im et ha'emtzeim ki'ilu einam. Rabbi Shimon ben Yotzadaq says, in the name of Rabbi Shimon, that we view the middle ones as if they're not there, meaning, let's say there's 10 bodies piled up in a space of 4 cubits. So we imagine, okay, we take off all the top ones or all the ones that are crowded. We leave one on the side, and one in the middle. 3 within a space of 4 to 8. Okay, if you have that, so if with taking off all the extra bodies, you still have 3 within a space of 4 or 8 cubits, that would work. That would be a burial plot. In any case, what do you see here? Both the Tanna Kamma and the second opinion, which we're assuming Tanna Kamma holds, it's Tanna Kamma explaining Rabbi Shimon here, versus the second explanation of Rabbi Shimon, which is all a debate about crowded in. Do we view it as if not, or view it like it is? The main point here is that what's the amount that they're talking about? 4 to 8. That sounds like both, right? That the opinion here holds like Rabbi Shimon, that it's 4 by 8. And then this source that we brought, this Mishna, Ohalot and Nazir, would be following Rabbi Shimon. Okay, now, that's our suggestion. But now we get back to the 20 cubits. Well, b'mayu kimta Rabbi Shimon, but then what? You're going to say this Mishna is Rabbi Shimon? But that doesn't make sense, the 20 cubits. Money. Who is this according to? Rabbi Shimon, it's Rabbi Shimon, it should be 22. If it's the rabbis, it should be 18. Again, how do we get that? Courtyard is 6. 2 caves on either side. According to the rabbis, 6 is the length. According to Rabbi Shimon, 8 is the length. 6 times 3 is 18. 6 plus 8 plus 8 is 22. So okay, so let me read it a little more, a better reading of the Gemara. I read it a little too quickly, but first the Gemara said, wait, how could you, we just claimed it's Rabbi Shimon based on that bright. How could you say Rabbi Shimon? If it's Rabbi Shimon, then it should be 20 cubits. 22. But then the Gemara says, wait a minute though. So you're going to say it's the rabbis, but Rabbanan, this is what I didn't read carefully. If it's the rabbis, there's a question. Well, then it should be 18. So if it's not Rabbi Shimon, then it's the rabbis. But if the rabbis, also doesn't really match. So now we're going to have 2 possible ways of going about it. Either really is the rabbis or it's really Rabbi Shimon. So the Gemara now says, fine. So we'll explain it like the rabbis. Now, if you explain it like the rabbis, we're back to square one though. The first part doesn't match the rabbis. So basically some of the commentaries either reread this and have a bit of a different girsa, or, which I'm not going to get into, or they say, just split the Mishna. The first part is Rabbi Shimon, the 4 to 8, and the part about the how far you have to check is according to the rabbis. A little hard to do that, but we've seen Mishnayot where they do that, and you're stuck. So the first explanation is Lo Olam Rabbanan Hi. Now, basically, we have to add an extra 2 cubits. Where do we get an extra 2 cubits? Well, Kigon de Badak Ba'alachsona. You checked on an angle. Okay, now what's this angle? Well, according to the rabbis, it's 4 by 6, right? Your cave. So if you find 3 bodies in the space of 4 by 6, what do? Well, you check 20 cubits, really 18. But where you found the dead bodies, you actually have to check on an angle, on a diagonal. Now, what would this mean? So back to the Pythagorean theorem. If it's 4 by 6, it'll actually be 7.2, the hypotenuse. So you'd have to check 7.2, but the rabbis always round up, and they round up to 8, and therefore they say 8. So that's how they get to 8. And they say the following. So you check. Now, why do you have to do this? There's a lot of different interpretations given. Perhaps we don't know if you're walking in a straight line here, if you find the bodies in a straight line, and therefore, maybe you've already gone on an angle, so you got to add a little more for that. Maybe we just want you to be extra sure, so we add on a little more to go angled. It's a little unclear, but let's just go with that. And then they say, wait a minute. If you're going to say you have to check on a diagonal and add on 2 cubits, well, then on the opposite side, where you're checking and assuming there's a second burial cave, you should also, midaha ba'alachsona, hanami ba'alachsona, the other side should be angled, which means on the diagonal, which means you should add another 2 cubits. It should end up 22. So how'd you get to only 20 according to this? To which they answer, right? And then it's room b'tartin havian. It should be 22. To which they answer, no. We make it a little stricter where you found the dead bodies. But on the other side, when you get to measuring and you don't even find dead bodies there, we don't make you go the extra 2 cubits to check even more on the angle. Okay, a bit of a weak answer for a number of reasons. Number one, the beginning part of the mission doesn't match the rabbis, so you'd have to say Rabbi Shimon the rabbis, unless, like I said, some come up with some other explanation for that. And it's a bit of a fetch on an angle. We're not exactly sure why on a diagonal. And why not on the other side diagonal? It's not totally convincing. Turning out, I would bet we'll get a different answer where we will bring this back to Rabbi Shimon. And maybe this is really a better answer. And when we have a question, difficulty and resolution here, it actually works a little smoother. Let's just explain that it really is Rabbi Shimon. And why do we then, instead of 22, it's only 20? Well, this actually we quoted the other day. We're talking about burial plots of infants or stillborns, right? Where they have much smaller plots. And therefore, if you found a burial plot where there were infants buried or stillborns, then you basically would be able to cut a little bit. You wouldn't have to count the full 22 because the burial plots were shorter. So now they say, okay, but just like we asked before, if this side we're going to cut, then why don't we cut on the other side as well? Why don't we assume that on the other side, it's also for stillborns? To which the Gemara answers, Timnes Rehavia. No, it's sorry, and then it should be Timnes Re. It should be 18. This is part of the question. To which they answer, Tre benifle amrinan, tarte benifle lo amrinan. Sorry, Chada benifle amrinan, tarte benifle lo amrinan. One burial plot has the stillborns, but we're not going to assume just because this one has stillborns, the opposite one has stillborns, and all the more so you would think not. Like if this is a family burial plot, so there's one area where the stillborns are, and there's another area, right? The other area probably wasn't for stillborns. So that's not really a concern, and that's how we can explain the 20 according to Rabbi Shimon. Now we have a problem because the Braita we quoted with Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda saying what Rabbi Shimon's opinion was is going to create a problem here because they're going to say Rami de Rabbanan de Rabbanan, Rami de Rabbi Shimon de Rabbi Shimon. Well, if we're assuming that there's a machloket here between Tanna Kamma and this opinion of Rabbi Shimon that Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda explained, that's going to contradict the opinion of a Tanna Kamma and Rabbi Shimon in a different Mishnah. Okay, what's this Mishnah? Well, this is a Mishnah that has some, okay, now here we're focusing exclusively on the issue of, not what we were talking about, the 4x8 and all that. We're talking about the issue of things piled on top of another and having too many, okay? According to Rabbi Shimon in our issue, the Rabbi Shimon ben Yehuda in the name of Rabbi Shimon, we view the bodies as if they're not there, right? We kind of say, oh yeah, let's just, as if, imagine they're not there. And it's like we have 3 in a space of 4 or a space of 8 or somewhere between 4 and 8. The rabbis say, no, we don't do that. If they're piled up, we assume they're piled up and they were meant to be removed. Well, in a totally different issue, but at first glance, this looks to be the same thing. And their opinions are going to be the opposite. And here we're going to see, so Rami de Rabbanan and Rabbanan, Rami de Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon, there's a total contradiction between the opinion of Tanna Kamma, and Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Shimon. How so? Now this should be Ditnan, not Titania. It's a Mishnah, as it says in a Mishnah. It's a Mishnah Kilayim, just talking about mixed breeds. Now, it means I planted in my vineyard crops like grains, which I'm not allowed to do. But only, now the Torah level, now this is going to be a problem even if it's by rabbinic law, it's going to be a problem. But by Torah law, it's only going to be a problem if this is technically called a vineyard. So what is called a vineyard? Well, generally vines are planted within rows with 4 cubits of space in between, so you can get through, plow, do other things, fix the land, everything. You need some space to walk. So kerem hanatua al pachot me'arba amot, if you have a vineyard that has less than 4 cubits between the rows, Rabbi Shimon omer, ain't no kerem, it's too crowded. We don't call that a kerem. Now notice he doesn't say we view the middle one as if it's not there. Chachamim omrim, harei ze kerem, v'ro'im et ha'emtzaim ki'ilu einam. Now if the rabbis hadn't come, maybe you would think kerem is different. But here the rabbis appear as the opposite opinion, and they say you view it as if it's not, right? You can imagine as if the inner ones that block off, right, that make it less than 4, it's as if they're not there, because you'll probably uproot them because it's going to affect the way your stuff grows. And therefore, we view them as if they're not there. So the rabbis employ this use of, we view it as if it's not there. Rabbi Shimon does it. Exactly the reverse of what they did in the case of the graves. So how do we deal with this? So kasha de Rabbanan de Rabbanan, they're just repeating, and kasha de Rabbi Shimon de Rabbi Shimon. Total contradiction. Well, now the Gemara is going to explain. No. Cases are different. Even though at first glance this looks the same, they're really very different. To Rabbi Shimon lo kasha, Rabbi Shimon doesn't contradict himself because hatam lo nati inashe adata le'akil. In the case of the crops, you didn't plant things in order to uproot them. You're gonna leave them and just see how they grow. But and that's why we don't view it as if it's not there. But sometimes it happens. The person died right before nightfall, maybe nightfall on Friday afternoon, or maybe just nightfall in general. And you just kind of threw the body there, figured you come back, and then who knows, something happened. Maybe, you got kicked out of the town, Gentiles came and kicked the Jews out, or something happened and you never made it back there. So that would be why you can view them like they're not there, because maybe they were just thrown on top here in a rush. Rabbanit nami lo kashi. And why aren't the rabbis contradicting each other? Well, this is a disgusting way to bury people, and therefore we can't call this a grave. You don't say, "Oh, we view them as if they're not there." They're there, and it's a disgusting way to bury people. We're disgraceful. But in the case of the vines, it could be you leave them, and what grows nicely grows nicely, and what doesn't grow nicely, you'll use as twigs and for firewood. So theoretically, you might actually leave it there. Whereas the bodies, if you had known it was there, you never would have left it like that, and that's why you can view it as if they're not there, and we're not going to view it as, just 1 second. No, sorry, I didn't say that right. Since it's minavel lo mikre kever, the whole issue, looking through the rabbi's perspective, the whole issue of a grave is, do we call this a grave? Do we call this a vineyard? Well, this is a disgraceful way to bury people, so we don't call this a kever. This isn't the way you bury people. You wouldn't bury people like that in any normal way, so it's not called a grave. Whereas according to for the vineyard issue, though, this could be a vineyard, and it's crowded. Some hopefully will grow well, and the others will grow and use for something else, so we could still call that a kerem, a vineyard. And with that, Hadran alach mocher perot, and we finished the chapter. Moving now to the next Mishna. The next Mishna is all about, the next chapter, we're starting with selling a field, going back to the 4th chapter. If you sell someone a field, the question is, if you said a certain measurement, what is included in that measurement? So, ha'omer lechavero, beit kor afar ani mocher lecha. If you say to your friend, I'm selling you a beit kor, which is 30 se'ah, where you could plant 30 se'ah of grains, but you didn't point out a particular field, or it's, let's say, in a much bigger field, and you say, I'm selling you 30 se'ah in this field, a beit kor. Well, now you have to measure. So if there were these big rocks that are 10 tefachim high, where you obviously can't plant, or deep ditches, 10 tefachim deep, that you can't plant in, that's not counted as part of the calculation. But if they're less than 10 tefachim high, this sounds like laws of Shabbat and Eruvim, where 10 tefachim is a measurement of its own independent space. If it's not that deep, then then it's considered part of the field, and it does count. So if you have a certain amount of space, if it has these deep ditches or big, tall stones that you can't plant in, then we don't count that space as part of your bait, right? That's not counted as plantable space. But if it's less than that, then we do. The ima marlo kibeit kor afar, like a beit kor afar. But you didn't say exactly beit kor, but it's like a beit kor. Then אפילו היו שם נקעים עמוקים יותר מ10 טפחים, או סלעים גבוהים יותר מ10 טפחים, הרי אלו נמדדים עימם. Then it doesn't matter. You're going to count that as well, because, right, you're going to count the space, because you didn't say exactly, is it like, and then we're going to include whatever comes in. Okay, now we're going to start a Mishnah, which we'll only just get started on, but there's a Mishnah that comes up in Erchin, about someone who sanctifies a field. Okay, we talked about this. If you sanctify an ancestral field, then the value is dependent on what year in the Shemitah year you're up to. For every year, it's 1 shekel kesef, so 50 altogether, 50 shekel kesef, for a field that is a beit kor, the same size that we're discussing. So there, it's going to be a similar issue, and then the Gemara is going to have a question on this, but we'll get to all that tomorrow, or in the next shiur. Hamakdish sadeu b'shat hayovel. If it's the Jubilee year, which basically means you have 50 years ahead of you, and you consecrate your field, noteno lebeit zera chomer seorim 50 shekel kesef. This is based on a pasuk in the Torah. You give for the amount of where you could plant 30 se'ah of barley, 50 shekel kesef for that amount for the 50 years. But ayusham nikaim amukim 10 tvachim or slaim gvohim 10 tvachim. But if there were these nikaim or slaim that are 20, that are 10 high, 10 handbreadths high, they're not counted in terms of, right, this space. So again, it's all proportional. So if you could plant the 30 se'ah of se'orim, but some of the place you really can't plant anything, so you deduct that from, right? Because if, let's say, it was only one se'ah, so it would be 1/30th of the 50 shekel kesef. If though of that one se'ah, some of it even can't be planted, then it's even less. Okay, but pachot mikam, but if it was less than 10 tefachim tall, then nimdedimima. This sounds very similar to what we just said in our Mishna, and we'll get back to this. The Gemara is going to immediately have a question. So let's do a quick summary. We started with this Mishnah about the dead body. You find 1, you find 2, you find 3. What the difference is, what's considered a shkunat kvara, and then what do you have to do? How long do you have to measure? We then had to try to reconcile this with either the rabbis or Rabbi Shimon. We struggled a little. Today we brought this other Braita, and then we got into that Braita and said that Braita totally contradicts. The opinions are flipped from what they appear by us, but we resolved. By what they appear in this vineyard case about Kilei Akarim. Then we said those two are very different cases. And then we just ended with the Mishnah that we just said, so no need to review it. And with that, we'll finish for today. Again, maybe I will review the Mishnah for a second, all about how we measure a field. If you bought a field, you assume you meant for planting, right? If you said, I want a baked core, which is a measurement for planting, then it doesn't include spaces that you can't plant in, but only if they're really blocked, like 10 tefachim deep or 10 tefachim high, as a block, then that area won't be counted. Otherwise, it will be counted in your count, and similar with the calculation for the amount you have to give to the temple if you consecrate your field. With that, wishing everyone again a Chag Sameach, Shabbat Shalom, Shana Tova, K'tiva B'Chatima Tova.